This is a bum rap. I'm Robert Bumgardner, and I'm developing a podcast uh, on obtaining confessions, interviews, and interrogations. The reason I'm doing this, my background is law enforcement from 1979. Uh, I worked 6 years for the city police department, transferred to a county department in 1986. Did a couple more years in uniform for about a total of 8 years. Transferred, got an assignment in CID. If you're like me or anything like me, you might have a friend or a spouse that just love to watch uh, the different police shows that are on TV that may involve forensics or 48 hours or whatever you want to call it. And somewhere in that program, you're going to see detectives go into an interview room and try to obtain a confession on their case. Usually it's just a small segment and so forth, but uh, I don't really watch those programs, but my wife is very entertained by them, and she'll ask me questions about the interviews, ask me questions about a case that she's looking at. And it came to my mind that investigations and forensics and DNA, satellites, tracking networks, phone networks with triangulation, ballistics. We've come a long way in the last 25 years in terms of the tools that law enforcement has at their disposal. There, there's really one tool that it's not going to be developed a whole lot through DNA, and that's called talking to people. So while I may take it for granted, having been involved in this process for years and years, uh, and I would train other coworkers throughout the years on how to do this, possibly if they showed an interest. I thought it might be beneficial to do a podcast for how did I do it? How did I get there? Well, let's say you're a uniform officer with some years of experience on the road. You want to change. You have an interest in working as a detective, or you're a new detective. You've been assigned to CID, and at some point you're going to have to do interviews and interrogations. What type of training did you get in law enforcement in the police academy uh, to prepare you for this? Well, I'll just wait till I go to CID, and somehow the information, the ability will just fall in my lap. Maybe my supervisors will help me do this. Maybe the county commissioners, the city council will be very concerned about my ability to do an interview, the government, and don't count on it. Uh, the time for you to prepare to think about doing interviews and interrogations is before you ever get there. What I did, and what anybody else can do, if you're taking this seriously, is I got my hands on any type of books, literature, computers, uh, in-house classes uh, for the COVID problems that we had. They had this thing called school where you would go to your state academy, and they would have a curriculum that would be listed, uh, dates, times. Sometimes your government would pay for your training, to transport you. You might even have a government car that you could get. I took some classes from Georgia down to Florida that were paid for by the government, and I was able to take a government car, which is pretty beneficial. I've also taken classes in the Carolinas where uh, the government didn't pay me anything to take these classes. I paid for them out of my pocket. If you're wondering why that's so important, is because when you go into an interview room and you may be by yourself or you may have another person with you who may have less capabilities than you have. Once you walk out of that room, if you got the confession or you did not get confession, it's totally on you. It's just yourself and the purpose in the room. You may have an investigation that's gone on for weeks, months, or years, but your opportunity to conduct this interview once the perp's been arrested is extremely, extremely limited. It's a very short period of time. If you think about an hour, maybe 2 or 3 hours, that's not a long period of time if you've worked on this case for 6 months or 12 months. You hopefully you'll have evidence on a rare occasion, pretty much like I like to have my steak. Uh, we've had a little bit of evidence. What are you going to do when you go to an interview room and you don't have your satellite images and your triangulations and your DNA and all those little computer tricks that are you know that are possible today? What if you don't have that? What if you just arrested or someone arrested the perp and you don't have all these advantages? You don't have a DNA match. You don't have a fingerprint match and so forth. You should be confident that you and your team arrested the individual, but what do you do now? You don't have a video. And this particular crime wasn't posted on Twitter or Facebook. It's just you and the bad guy. What are you going to do? That's the reason it's really important that you as an individual are responsible for what type of training you're going to seek. You may go to a CID class, a detective class. You may get a very minor part of that entire curriculum, may cover a little bit of interviews and interrogations. But remember that when your supervisor says it's your turn to interview this person out of a group of ever how many detectives you have in your group, you better be ready. And don't count on someone else giving you that knowledge or the techniques or what I call tools in a toolbox. Sometimes you need to get it's your responsibility if you want to do this sort of work to get those tools yourself. So I mentioned state academies. There's some colleges that are down in Florida. I took some in Orlando, and there's some. You could find a class or a book on interviews and interrogations just about anywhere. But don't count on your police department to be concerned about how good you are at getting your confession. After all, if you don't do your job, you could always just pass the whole thing off onto your district attorney's office and complain about them not either convicting the perpetrator or seeking an indictment, which happens all the time. Uh, this is an introduction to interviews and interrogations. It's going to be in 3 parts. The next and these are for anybody that wants to watch the podcast. Will be 3 parts. The next part will be you're now a detective and you're going to do an interview, despite the training that you may or may not have. When you walk through the door, you're going to have an appearance. So I'm going to talk about the appearance that a detective may want to consider when he's going to start his interview. You've got a room, you've got a door, you got tables, chairs inside. Hopefully, you got cameras. Nowadays, they have monitors. They didn't have any of that uh, type of equipment when I started. They do now. But how are you going to present yourself? What is your appearance? What should your appearance be? Uh, Again, this is Robert Bumgardner. This is a bum rap, uh, and we'll go on to part 2, and then a part 3, and then we'll go to the last. The interviews and the interrogations will be subscription format. It's for law enforcement only. Uh, Other people just have to continue watching the police shows and wondering about how did they do that? How did they get to that point? Thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the next podcast.